So, good afternoon, or let's say good evening, everyone. So, for tonight, we would be talking about the different formative and summative assessment. So, first, let's talk about this picture. So, classroom assessment alternatives. So, what can you say about this picture? So, clearly, it depicts of ano ba kayo as students today. First, you study, you take the test. If you pass the test, it's either you forget what you learned from those uh, lessons. So for today, we would be talking about the different classroom assessment alternatives, especially during this pandemic. But first, let us review what are those assessment. So what does assessment means? Assessment means Assessment means the process of gathering data about students' achievement. This is according to Dinsa Omar and Waldrip. Also, they also talk about that assessment is a paradigm that shifted from testing students' learning to students assessing of students to assessing for students' learning. So, di ba, may pagkakaiba na siya. Next is it significantly affects students' approach to learning. Number one is to accelerate tests or to construct meaning that will sustain their long-term learning. So dati kasi it was proven that some students would just study or would just take assessment just to pass. But for today, you need to take assessment making sure that you have learned something. So let us talk about the different assessment. So we have the formative and summative. So number one, the formative versus the summative, the traditional versus alternative, traditional versus authentic, traditional versus outcome based, and traditional versus performance assessment. So look at this part of the screen. It shows the difference between a formative assessment and a summative assessment. So formative assessment looks like when the chef tastes the soup. But for a summative assessment, when the guest tastes the soup. So, di ba, may pagkakaiba. Next, so let's see the difference between formative and summative assessment. So, hopefully, you are taking screenshots of these lessons. So, number one, for summative assessment, its goal is to prove that you have learned something. But formative is that you are on that level, then after testing that, you would improve. For summative, to make judgment about the student's performance. So, check the, okay, did he learn something or not? But for formative, after getting the score, what could be improved? What could be enhanced? What could be, ano ba, sa anong part pa ba natin matutulungan yung estudyante? For example, sa ano tayo ha, reading. Pag sabi mo, for summative assessment, kukuha kayo ng reading test. Pag summative assessment yan, okay, the student got 95 over 100 in the reading test. So, ibig sabihin, it is just a pass or fail. Pero pag nakakuha ka ng 75, which is very low in today's standards, or let's say, halimbawa, cut-off natin sa education, we have 83. So, if 75, this is just checking the student's performance. It is just a judgment. It's either a pass or a failure. Yun yung summative assessment. But if you are going for a formative assessment, this is what to enhance students' learning. So in the past, 'di ba, meron tayong Phil Erie, which discusses the different stages of the students' uh, reading comprehension skills. So we have the frustration, the dependent, and the independent. So the whole class was tested. After that, you categorize your students. So, based on those category, yung frustration, dependent, and independent, dun ka nagagawa ng mga activities on how could you help improve yung students na nasa level ng frustration. Anong gagamitin mong activity for those students who are on the dependent level, and ano yung gagamitin mo naman na activities for independent learner. Kasi nga, the purpose of those formative tests is to check kung saan ka mag-a-adjust. So, next. So, summative assessment, it occurs after instruction. So, usually, this is what? After the lesson. So, usually, this is the evaluation part on the lesson plan. 'Di ba? Naturo na lahat ng teacher, nag-activity na, lahat-lahat. May may groupings na, may reporting na nangyari. After that, it's judgment time. They would check if you have learned something. But if it is formative assessment, it occurs during instruction. So, bali dito na part, this is what that we call the scaffolding. Ini-enhance yung mga estudyante. Kasi, it is parang dinadirect yung student kung ano yung dapat nilang maintindihan or malaman. So, for summative, it occurs at a particular point in time to determine what the students know. So, usually this is what? Ito na yung mga exams, kung ano yung nalaman nyo for the prelim, midterms, and finals. But, for formative, it's a continuous basis. It doesn't end. It's not even the end of your life pag may formative assessment. Mamamatay ka lang sa resulta ng iyong exam, pero hindi ka mamamatay sa resulta ng iyong ano, summative test, ng iyong quiz. So, sa summative test, the teacher's role is to give students grades and determine if content taught was retained. Okay, yun lang yung purpose nyon. Kung lahat ba ng tinuro ng teacher is na-absorb nyo, or not just absorb, you have learned it, or na-studyhan nyo. Kasi, depende na yan sa inyo. But, for formative, the role of the teacher is to monitor the instruction based on students' performance to improve learning. So, this is a check and balance kasi there are times that maybe the strategy or the instruction of the teacher is not appropriate for that lesson. So, dahil dun sa score mo sa formative assessment, doon mag-a-adjust si teacher. Kasi kung hindi mag-a-adjust si teacher, baka nga pala yung strategies and instruction niya pala hindi nag-fit. Especially if your teacher is monotonous. Like, pare-parehong strategy yung ginagamit niya. Mag-copy-paste. Masama yun. But if the teacher has a variety of strategy or iba-iba yung ginagamit niya sa inyo, just to make sure that your class would be interesting, would be fruitful, and you get to enjoy the class. So let's pause for a while. Thank you for listening.